Hello and welcome to our next lecture for business ethics. Today we're going to be talking about organizational culture. Before we get into the lecture, a few housekeeping things. The first is that quiz 8 is going to be due on April 30th. I also wanted to let you guys know that both of the live debates have been cut. It just didn't seem like that was something that was going to work this semester, given the dynamics. The grade allotment has kind of changed a little bit, so view the syllabus on As You Learn to see how that breaks down now. Also wanted to let you guys know that the individual case assignment instructions and an example have been posted to As You Learn. The individual case assignment is going to be due on May 8th on As You Learn. The current events, as I've said before, you have until the end of the semester, April 30th, to submit both of your current events. So that includes the recording and the slideshow. And we're getting to the end here, so we only have a few assignments left. So quiz 8 and 9 are the last two quizzes that we have. Those are both going to be due on April 30th. Exam 2, or the final exam, my plan is to open that exam May 1st and close it May 8th, and it will be, in terms of format, identical to the first exam that you guys took. And so you'll have a week there to finish the exam. And then the individual case analysis, which again I've posted the instructions and an example of a case analysis that I wrote for you guys to look at how that works. If you have any questions or comments about the assignments for the class, please don't hesitate to post the question on the student question lobby forum on As You Learn, or contact me via email. I think for the most part here we're getting to the end, so let's finish that up. And we've got today's lecture, and then we've got one more lecture on the environment that hopefully I'll post here shortly, and then we're done. So for today's class, so we want to talk about corporate and organizational culture. And culture is something that you guys may have discussed in some of your other classes, but it's a topic that I find particularly interesting. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about organizational culture, the elements of culture, orientation of culture, and shaping culture. And our reason for discussing culture is really to get to this idea of ethical culture. And to kind of build on a reading that we had at the very beginning of the semester, the Trevino and Brown Myths of Business Ethics article, in which at the very end of the article they provide some steps to creating an ethical culture at an organization. Along with that, we're going to pay some special attention to pay for performance and motivation, talk briefly about ethical leadership, and then we'll finish up talking about speaking up and whistleblowing, and then very briefly some ideas and thoughts about employee-owned firms. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. There's an interesting situation that is going on with regards to business ethics. So if we look at business implementation, we can see that 96% of Fortune 500 companies now have a code of ethics. We're seeing budget and staffing for ethics and compliance to remain stable, if not increase into the future. These ethics and compliance officers, there's now an Ethics and Compliance Officer Association. Annual rankings of the most ethical businesses, the greenest businesses, these sorts of rankings. And then organizations dealing with business in practice, the Better Business Bureau, the Business Roundtable, and the Ethics Resource Center. All organizations that have been established in order to assist and promote businesses adopting business ethics. But as we've talked about a number of times this semester, there is this question: with so many firms implementing institutional means of ethics, why does ethical wrongdoing continue? And this gets to the Trevino and Brown myth number 3, in the myths of business ethics reading from the beginning of the semester, that formal ethics codes and programs can have a positive effect on ethical decision making, but by themselves do not guarantee effective ethics management. And that employees have to perceive formal policies go beyond mere window dressing to represent the real ethical culture of the organization. So, these institutional or these formal means of ethics have to be seen as part of a larger coordinated cultural system that supports ethical conduct every day. And there's an interesting study that was done in 2004 in the Journal of Business Ethics, which really shocked much of the business community, that showed that codes of ethics for companies really had very little influence on whether or not employees made ethically correct choices. That the factor that had a significant effect on whether or not an organization or whether or not employees of an organization behaved ethically was the culture of the company. So that kind of gets to this idea of organizational culture, and so if we're going to talk about business ethics, we should probably talk about the most effective mechanism to influence the ethical behavior of employees, and that clearly is organizational culture. So when we think about organizational culture, we can define it as the shared values and beliefs of employees within any given organization. And it's based on norms and behavior patterns. We can think about it as guiding beliefs and understandings that are shared by members of an organization, and they're taught to new members as the correct way to think, feel, and behave. And the very interesting thing about culture is that when someone is in a culture, their behaviors that are adapted to that culture, or their behaviors that are in alignment with the culture, seem rational and normal, and any behavior that deviates from the dominant culture is seen as abnormal. And organizational culture exists at two levels. There are the observable symbols and the underlying values. And the metaphor that's often used for this is the iceberg. That the interesting thing about organizational culture is that the observable symbols, the ceremonies, stories, slogans, dress, physical settings, is really the tip of the iceberg that's above the water, and the vast majority of an organization's culture are these unobservable, features. So the underlying values, assumptions, beliefs, attitudes, and feelings, and that is the bulk of it. So these observable artifacts, things like dysfunctional meetings and new task forces, these are the visible and feelable structures and processes in an organization. So, for those of you that are taking business strategy right now, the observable artifacts are often referred to as organizational architecture in strategy circles. And this is it also includes observed behavior. But the problem with observed behavior is it's difficult to decipher. So it can be difficult to understand the meaning behind it. The underlying or unobservable underlying values of culture include the espoused beliefs and values, personal responsibility, do the right thing, get buy-in from those implementing decisions, fight bitterly in business meetings yet be friends, real teamwork. And so these are the ideals, goals, values, and aspirations of an organization. It also includes ideologies of an organization, and it also includes rationalizations. And the interesting thing is that they rationalizations that may or may not be congruent with behaviors and other artifacts. Also included in rationalizations are the basic underlying assumptions. So the best way to fit is to go along, to get along. Accuracy and truth are more important than speed. So how we understand the world. So what is the right way, or what is the way in which we move? And interestingly, rationalizations, as we've talked a lot about this semester, are often unconscious and taken for granted beliefs and values, which can make them particularly difficult to identify. And rationalizations are critical, as we've talked a lot about, in that it determines behavior, perceptions, thoughts, and feelings. and the assumptions, routines, and heuristics of an organization. So the type 1 type thinking. And so that's, again, a very interesting thing to think about. When we talked about biases and heuristics, we talked about systems 1 type thinking being the dominant way in which we make decisions, particularly as things get busy and there are conflicting or lots of demands. We're simply not in a position to do a rational cost-benefit analysis for these sorts of decisions. And so we rely on heuristics and routines and standard operating procedures in order to make those decisions. And clearly, the interesting thing is that it not only is, or this explains in part why culture has such a big impact on employee ethical behavior, because most of the decision making that's made, are these unexamined decisions. So if we think about culture as assumptions, and we start thinking about how it might apply to business ethics, we can take two different kind of cultures or two different kind of assumptions about the way the world works. So one is this the need for incentives. And so someone that is in a culture that makes this sort of assumption might say something that the average worker wants a job in which he does not have to put much physical effort. Above all, he wants a job in which he does not have to think. And it's an alternative approach, a motivated or need opportunity culture. I think most of us are looking for a calling, not a job. Most of us have jobs that are too small for our spirit. Jobs are not big enough for people. There's nothing I would enjoy more than a job so meaningful to me that I brought it home. And so the lazy need culture is Henry Ford in 1922. And then the need opportunity or the motivated assumption comes from Nora Watson in a book, a very famous book about work and motivation, which really started this trend or this turn towards positive psychology in the workplace. And so we'll talk a little bit more about some of those ideas when we talk about incentives. But there's a very interesting kind of transition that's occurred over the last century, in that initially there was this belief or this assumption that you have to force employees to work, that they don't want to work on their own. Now we've understood that while brute force may have use in some specific work contexts, it certainly doesn't apply to all work contexts. And we can think about different organizations or different businesses having different assumptions about employees' motivation to work, and that's going to manifest itself in a number of different ways. So organizational culture, is based on what the group within the firm learns about what is acceptable and not acceptable, and it provides a sense of organizational identity and serves two critical functions. One is to integrate members so they know how to relate to each other, so the internal integration, the collective identity, and know how to work together. And similarly, how to help organizations adapt to the external environment. So this is the external adaptation, or how the organization meets goals and deals with outsiders. So the very interesting thing to recognize, or the important thing to recognize, is that every organization has a culture. Whether or not that culture is intentional, whether or not anyone at the organization has thought about how to modify or change that culture, may or may not be true, but every organization has a culture. Every organization, there are patterns and routines in which individuals interact with each other that are going to establish, irregardless of whether or not you intend to establish those routines. Similarly, how an organization understands its place in the world, or how individuals that are members of an organization understand the relationship between the organization and the outside world, is also going to establish and cement itself. And we'll talk a little bit more about that process in a little bit, but the key point is to recognize that all organizations have culture, have a culture, and while there's some consequences to that culture, it's important to understand that the existence of a culture or a social agreement is critical in terms of allowing individuals to interact with each other, both within the organization and interact with individuals outside of the organization. So we can think about culture in a number of different ways, and one way in which to understand culture is through the strength of culture. And so this idea of cultural strength, and cultural strength is simply a way of identifying the degree of agreement among members of an organization about the importance of specific values. So strong cultures will have great influence on the behaviors of members, as well as increased cohesiveness. So it's one of the interesting paradoxes, and unfortunately, just due to time, I had to cut the diversity section of this class. But there's a very interesting paradox that exists in organizations, in that diversity is a way of weakening culture. So if you have a very strong culture, you're going to have a lot of folks with very similar worldviews, very similar understandings of the way the world works. And so this can have some positive effects. It can allow individuals to perform functions more efficiently, more effectively, because there is this high level of cohesiveness. Everyone in the organization understands each other. So diversity then, one of the problems, or one of the things to consider, is that diversity decreases cohesiveness in organizations. And so if you have different worldviews, different ways of understanding the world, different ways of interacting with each other, that can lead to if the diversity is high enough, to potential organizational dysfunction. And so there's this balance that firms, that all organizations face between increasing cohesiveness while also being open and allow for differing perspectives. The dominant culture is the core values that are shared by a majority of organizations' members. So the stronger an organizational culture, the more that the dominant culture will represent the views of members of the organizations. But there's also subcultures, and they tend to develop in large organizations to reflect common problems, situations, or experiences of selective or subgroup members. And the interesting thing about subcultures is they may mirror the dominant culture, but add to or modify the core values in ways that reflective of the unique experiences. So one interesting way, or one kind of example that comes to mind of subcultures is we can think about the U.S. Navy having a specific culture. There's a way in which things are understood, authority structures, the discipline that exists in the Navy. And then we can think about the culture of the Navy SEALs. And so many of the aspects, or many of the cultural elements of the Navy, are going to be reflected in the subculture of Navy SEALs, but there's going to be some unique features because of the experience, the unique experience that Navy SEALs face, that other members of the Navy may not. And so you get those differences. Now there are also situations in which you have subcultures that react to the dominant culture, and so we see this in organizations in which you have a group that for some reason has had a negative experience and may actively resent the dominant culture of an organization, and then that can create some particularly interesting situations. Situations in which you get really novel or interesting ideas, but also conflict and dysfunction. So again, getting to this idea of the balance between cohesiveness and diversity. We can also think about, in addition to intensity, we can also think about orientation of culture. And so there's this circumplex of organizational culture that's been developed and used for a number of years. And so the axes of this circumplex are strategic force. So is the organization oriented towards itself, so looking inward, or is the organization looking outward? So this external or internal orientation of the organization. And then there's also this response to or needs of the environment. So on the one extreme, there's flexibility, so an ability to kind of adapt and change, to stability. The kind of consistency and not deviating when situations apply. And the interesting thing to think about is there are situations in which being at any one point in the circumplex may be appropriate or inappropriate. There's instances in which being highly flexible is going to cause problems for an organization. There are instances in which being extremely externally focused may be problematic for an organization. And so the key is kind of thinking about where, based on the context, based on the goals and the environment in which an organization is in, to think about which culture is going to make the most, which factors are going to make the most sense. And then we can based on this these two orientations, the needs of the environment, strategic focus, we can think about four kind of generic types of culture. And so these include the adaptivity culture. The strategic focus is on the external environment through flexibility and changing to meet customers' needs. A mission culture, which is suited for organizations concerned with serving specific customers in the external environment, but without the need for rapid change. A clan culture, primarily focused on the individual and participation of the organization's members and on rapidly changing expectations from the external environment. Or the bureaucratic culture, which has an internal focus and a consistency orientation for a stable environment, supports a methodological approach to doing business. And so, it's interesting, we can think about, the history of how managers were taught the ideal culture for an organization, and, back in the 1920s and 1930s, it was very much this bureaucratic culture. This idea of establishing rules and insulating the organization or the production function from the external environment as much as possible. That was the role of management, was to kind of create that bureaucratic culture so that the work could be done as efficiently as possible. You fast forward 100 years, and now the dominant way in which we train managers is in this adaptability culture. This idea of being dynamic, the dynamic capabilities that we talk about in strategy courses, the ability to pivot. And so it's very interesting that within management, we've gone from one extreme to the other in terms of the kind of the culture that we say is the best. And again, what I would argue is none of these are inherently better or worse than another. It depends on the context in which you're in. So there's some situations in which having a bureaucratic culture can be critical. So thinking about folks that are thinking about the military, for example, if you are in the military, it's this idea of being separate and these important values and chain of command, these sorts of elements Whereas if you're in a tech startup, the adaptability may be more relevant, more important. If you're managing a soup kitchen, having the mission culture may be particularly relevant. Again, it depends on the situation in which you're in. However, there does seem to be a relationship, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about ethical culture and ethical leadership, but there does seem to be some relationship between flexibility and external orientation and ethical leadership. So shaping culture. So how do organizational cultures form, and what are the ways in which managers can change the culture if the culture proves to be dysfunctional? And the primary way in which cultures form are through the primary embedding mechanisms. And so these are really the ultimate source of an organizational culture are its founders. What's the original mission of an organization? What is when the company was founded, how were things done? And so it's a very interesting thing in that oftentimes many of these organizations that have been around for decades still embody the culture and ethos and values of the original founders of the company. When founders start a business, they have a vision of what the organization should be. And again, whether or not that's explicit or implicit, there is a way in which founders understand how things should be done. So an example that is a little personal for me is I think about my father's company, who I think I've talked about that in a prior lecture. But my father founded a masonry drill bit manufacturing facility in Columbia, South Carolina, and he started it in 1979, and that was right when this kind of transition to the team and the openness and was really starting to take off. And so unlike the companies that my father saw, he decided that he was going to develop, or what he wanted his company to be was very much this team orientation. And so that's how he started the company. Everyone was called by their first names. The lowest employee still called my dad by his first name. There was this idea of creating friends at work. So my father facilitated social gatherings, and what's interesting is that's the culture that prevailed for 20 years at the company. So again, what the culture that exists when the firm was organized tends to be the culture throughout the organization's life. And the other thing that's when you're starting a business from scratch, there's no other culture, no other competing narrative that exists, which allows the culture of the founders to flourish. Additionally, new organizations are typically small, and so that allows for the founders to imprint their values on the organization, through the kinds of people that are there and those sorts of things. But what happens when a company is established, so an existing company? And so while less powerful, less influential than the primary embedding mechanisms or the founder's initial vision, are these secondary articulation, selection, and reinforcement mechanisms. And so these are things like the explicit goal of the selection process is to identify and hire individuals with the knowledge, skills, and abilities to perform successfully in the organization. And also the actions of top management will have a major impact on an organizational culture. So what does the top managers, how do they respond to situations, and employees tend to follow. So these modes of secondary articulation are things like, and this is the organizational architecture, so structures, so the processes, policies, governance, funding, committees, these establish the conditions under which interactions occur. Stories, so narratives based on true events that are frequently shared among employees, told to new employees to inform them about an organization, things like heroes, legends, and myths. So who are the ideal employees? So who is the top, the top employee at the company? And those stories, in very much in the same way that we use stories in society generally, are used as ways of both reflecting and reinforcing the kinds of acceptable and unacceptable behavior. So symbols, the ceremonies, stories, slogans, rites, they symbolize the deeper value of the organization. And so again, similarly, the interesting thing about stories or symbols is that they are both reflective as well as prescriptive. So Nike's "Just Do It" motto, it's both what the company believes in, but also an inspirational slogan. And then language, companies use specific sayings, slogans, metaphors, and other forms of language to convey special meaning to employees. And we talked a little bit about this when we talked about the Elizabeth Holmes and the Theranos story. That one of the really interesting things that you saw in the video was the way in which language, so specific use of language, was used in order to explain what the company was doing. Why were so many people? Why was the FDA not approving the Theranos machine? Well, it's because we're disruptors, and as disruptors, people are out to get us. And so the idea of using the word disruptor has a connotation in Silicon Valley as being positive. And there's a great there's that great HBO TV show Silicon Valley. It kind of takes the language of Silicon Valley to the nth degree to kind of show that at a certain point that language can be used in order to describe the world in a way in which the world or isn't actually. So it's language can be a particularly powerful way, again, in which we understand the world. And there's a whole field of philosophy, Wittgenstein and those kinds of folks that look at language and look at the way language influence our understanding of the world. So we won't go into that, but an interesting area of work. So ethical culture. So what do we mean by ethical culture? So the way ethical culture has been defined is a strong culture with a high risk tolerance, low to moderate aggressiveness, and a focus on means as well as outcomes is most likely to shape high ethical standards. So part of this makes sense. If you've got a very internally oriented organization that is very low, not very tolerant of risk, anything that kind of threatens the status quo, particularly if it comes from somewhere else, is likely to be rejected. And so if there's an unethical behavior that occurs in an organization, again, if there's a little tolerance for different ways of thinking, that unethical behavior is likely to continue. Similarly with aggressiveness, in a very aggressive organization, it's likely that individuals will rationalize their belief rather than trying to understand different perspectives. So the idea of preserving the core values and purpose, while also endlessly adapting business strategy and operating practices to a changing world. And so this is the paradox in which we've talked a bit about throughout this semester. We talked specifically about it when we talked about universalism and cultural relativism. But now we're applying it specifically within the confines of an organization. And if you remember in that lecture, one of the things that we talked about is this idea that if you're too open-minded, then you'll accept anything. But if you're too closed-minded, then you're likely to believe that your way of understanding the world is the only way of understanding the world. And so you have to find this right balance. Another important part of the ethical culture is that the whole is more important than the parts, and the boundaries between the parts are minimized. So this kind of holistic vision of the organization, so that you don't have sales fighting against accounting, that accounting and sales both recognize that they're important to the organization success. And so when you start having that infighting, it can lead to unethical behavior, and that the overall mission of the organization is greater or more important than the performance of any individual character in that organization. So you can think about when we talked about agency problems, and that one way in which agency problems can be addressed is through that the strong culture, because the employees recognize that they're there to do an important job, and that job has more value than their own individual gains. And that equality and trust are primary values, and that the culture encourages risk-taking, change, and improvement. So this is how we've understood, looking at different organizations, what tends to lead, or the kind of culture that seems to be most related to lower levels or more frequent levels of ethical behavior. But I would suggest, as we just talked about with the circumplex there, that these have to be couched and have to be understood in the context of that going to their extreme is also problematic. And so embedded in this idea of ethical culture is balance, and that any extreme is likely to lead to unethical behavior. So how do in an established firm, how do firms implement these? Well, Trevino and Brown in that very early reading gave us a really nice kind of step-by-step process here. The first is understanding the existing ethical culture, communicating the importance of ethical standards, focusing on the reward system, promoting ethical leadership throughout the firm. And finally, remembering that it's not easy to do these things, that these are particularly challenging. And as we go through each of these here, I think it'll become apparent that these are all things that are easier said than done. So understanding the existing ethical culture. This idea that leaders are responsible for transmitting culture in their organizations through what leaders pay attention to, measure, and control. And that reactions to critical incidents and organizational crises lead to deliberate role modeling, teaching and coaching. And that the criteria for recruitment, selection, promotion, retirement, and ultimately firing. What Trevino and Brown are kind of arguing here is that there are underlying assumptions that guide all of these behaviors. And one of the challenges, as we've talked about, understanding ethical decision making throughout this semester, one of the challenges can simply be understanding what are those underlying assumptions that are guiding these decisions. Is it the assumption that employees are lazy, or is it the assumption that employees show up to work because they want to be productive? So getting a pulse of what it is. So understanding what the key cultural messages being sent about ethics in an organization are. The interesting thing that Trevino and Brown talk about, and a lot of research supports, is this idea that most leaders don't know the ethical culture of an organization. Because the higher you go in an organization, the rosier the perception is going to be. Typically you don't find CEOs that dislike the company. Most CEOs have an incredibly positive view of the organization. And it's only when you get lower and lower down, all the way down to the lowest employee, that may have a highly critical view of the organization. And when we talked about biases, one of the interesting biases that if you remember, that we talked about was this idea that we tend to have a more positive image of ourselves than is actually true. And the more vested a CEO becomes in an organization, the more likely that individual will identify their own identity with the organization, and therefore, in order to protect the ego, they're going to have this bias, this rosy view bias. Whereas a lower level employee who's less vested in the organization is more likely to be open to a critical perspective. And so information can get stuck at lower levels. So if there's a bad ethical culture, it can be stuck at lower levels because of this perception, and that leaders are also insulated from bad news. That employees tend to, and we'll talk a little bit about this when we talk about voice, but there is a constraint on information moving up the hierarchy, because you never want to give bad news. So, what Trevino and Brown recommend is to collect data, both quantitative and qualitative, so survey data and other means of collecting data on organizational culture, but then also listening to what employees say, finding out who the organizational heroes are. Ask what stories veterans would tell a new hire about ethics in your organization. And that this can be incredibly helpful in identifying the needs for training and other interventions. So if the story that's being told to new hires by veterans, is a story of some ethical transgression, and it's told in a way that kind of is very positive and kind of a good time, that's likely to indicate that there's some problems in your organization's culture. So once you've understood, or once you've got a pulse on what the organizational culture is, the next step is communicating the importance of ethical standards. And so this idea that employees need clear and consistent messages that ethics is essential to the business model, not just a poster or a website. And that simply telling people to do the right thing is not enough. So tying ethics to the long-term success of business by providing examples, making sure that the message is coming from executives and supervisor leaders are clear and consistent, training employees to recognize the kinds of ethical issues that they're likely to arise in the workplace, demanding discussion of ethics and values as part of a routine business-making decision. So when making important decisions, ask, are we doing the right, i.e. ethical thing? Who could be hurt by this decision? Who could this affect? How could this affect our relationship with stakeholders and our long-term reputation? And being sure to let employees know about exemplary ethical conduct. So it's to me what's kind of interesting is if we think about a lot of organizations that simply adopt a code of ethics, that this is not that it's when we see ethics as an add-on to business decision making, it's unlikely to have much of a meaningful impact. And one of the examples that we can see in a related area is the turn to total quality management. So you guys may remember from your strategy courses, Sigma 6 and those kinds of quality production orientations that were developed in Japan and adopted in the US. that in the United States, quality control was very much seen prior to the 1980s and 90s as something that occurs at the end of the production function. And it was only when Sigma 6 and total quality management really took off that we understood that in order to increase quality, we had to imbue quality at every step of the production of a product. And it was only then that quality standards started to improve. And so a very similar situation occurs with ethics, that if we're only making decisions about the ethics of a decision once the decision has been made, it's going to be very difficult to make a strong argument that the ethical choice should supersede the unethical choice that has strategic benefits. So again, it's this idea of not seeing ethics as an add-on to your organization, but a way in which you understand decision making. And the interesting parallel here is that in most strategy courses, we wait to talk about ethics until the very end of the semester. So either in the last or second to last lecture for business strategy, it's only then that we start talking about ethics. And to me, this is quite interesting because we know that if we want ethics, business ethics, to be meaningful, it has to be integrated throughout the decision-making process. And so maybe in strategy courses, we should be talking about ethics throughout the semester. So when we talk about competitive advantage and SWOT analyses, integrating ethics into that decision making. So the other important thing, or the next step that Trevino and Brown recommend, is the focusing on the reward system. And this may be the single most important way to deliver a message about what behaviors are expected. People do what's rewarded and they avoid doing what's punished. That the best way to hold employees accountable for ethical conduct is to incorporate it in evaluations, so making it part of compensation and promotion decisions, so that the bottom line and ethical performance both count. And really emphasizing that unless individuals have both, they should not advance in the organization. And I can't tell you how many times this has occurred in my own life, where I've seen this happen, where you have someone who's at a company who's a high performer, but engages in some ethically questionable behaviors. I remember when I was a kid in high school, and I worked for a landscaping company. And one of the guys that got promoted to the team supervisor, that he made some incredibly questionable remarks about folks from Latin and South America. And so but he was good at his job, and so the decision was made to promote him, and then obviously or not obviously, but inevitably that led to some comments being made that ended up causing the company a lot of problems. So again, how you promote people is going to have a significant effect on the dominant culture. If you say that high performance is more important than ethics, then what's going to happen is performance is going to be prioritized over ethical behavior. And then also alternatively is rewarding exemplary ethical behavior. So Lockheed Martin's annual Chairman's Award is the example that is included in the textbook. And then making sure unethical conduct is not rewarded. So making sure it matters how outcomes are achieved. So we're just about at the hour mark here. So I'm going to pause this here for now, and then pick up the last remaining slides in the second part.